I've spent about 2 weeks now with the M1 powered Apple MacBook Air. It's the base spec version, the cheapest version you can get of this laptop. And if you're umming and erring about whether to get it, I have several reasons why I think you should. Let's get into it. Hello, welcome back to Ellis Reviews. If you haven't subscribed, hit that button now. So this is the long-awaited M1 powered MacBook Air. It's a really important computer. On the face of it, it just looks like any other MacBook Air from the last few years. But what's inside this is incredibly important going forward, not just for Apple, but I think for computing in general, really. Now, I've spent 2 weeks with it. I've used it day in, day out. I've used it for pretty much every task I normally use my MacBook 16-inch for, and I think it is absolutely amazing. So if you want a very quick review, there you go. Buy it, it's brilliant. However, there are a few things you need to know about it before you spend basically $999 on this laptop. It's not for everyone. I do think it's an amazing laptop, but you do have to bear a few things in mind before you buy it. We'll start with the battery life, which is just amazing. Now, I don't do benchmarks on this channel, and I don't really pay much attention to the rated hours for these. I'm not going to quote anything for that because it's been talked about thousands of times already. If you need to know that stuff, go out and find it. There's tons of really clever people out there who do very intensive tests for battery. All I can say about the battery life of this M1 MacBook Air, having used it for 2 weeks, is that it is definitely the best feature of the device. That might sound crazy, but these are laptops. And one thing I've always hated with laptops is them running out when you need them most. For example, if I take my beast of a 16-inch MacBook Pro out on the road, it's a worry battery life wise. I've never tested how long I get out of that big 16-inch laptop, but I know it's pretty impressive actually. Given its size and the kind of things I do with it, it's not bad, but I always take a charger with me because I just worry about it running out of battery. The MacBook Air, on the other hand, just goes on forever. It really does. Now, it's all day battery life, no question whatsoever. The M1 inside this laptop is brilliant in terms of power efficiency. It's iPad-like, that's probably the best way of putting it. I just don't worry about the battery life with this anymore, and that's all you need to know. The other thing which people don't seem to talk much about with this is the standby time. And for me, that's just as important. I don't want to have to keep thinking about plugging my laptop in to charge it. I appreciate I have to do that, but I don't want to keep thinking about it. And again, I've done no tests on this, but the standby time, it's incredible. You know, you lose a couple of percentage points overnight, for example, if at all, actually. I think it just completely powers itself down. And because with the M1 chip, it does come on immediately, you're instantly in there. It's just so convenient. Battery, amazing. Let's move on from the battery, but it is the best thing about this laptop. Now, software-wise, I made a list of the software that I use. So I use, in no particular order, I use Fantastical, I use Chrome occasionally, I use an email client called Spark, I use OmniFocus, Toggle, Teams, Trello, Slack, Ulysses, Word, Excel, Photoshop, Lightroom, Day One, Logic Pro, Final Cut Pro, just to name a few. And I've had no software issues with this M1 MacBook Air with any of those apps. Before I got this, I assumed that you couldn't run certain apps on it. So when I heard, for example, that Photoshop wasn't M1 ready yet, I was a bit disappointed, to be honest. And then I realized that actually you can run Intel apps on these M1 Macs. And the way it does that, it asks you to install something called Rosetta 2. That basically means the M1 MacBook acts like an Intel MacBook for those apps and lets them run, basically. And yeah, apart from that initial installation of Rosetta 2, which I don't quite understand. I don't know why that's just not installed by default. It's a bit odd, but you know, it takes seconds, so it's not a big deal. You do it once, that's it. But apart from that, you just don't notice it. They still launch quickly. I've not had any kind of weird crashes that seem to be related to running those apps on this M1 Mac. And yeah, it's just been seamless. So again, day to day, switching from the Intel-based 16-inch MacBook Pro to the M1-based MacBook Air has been totally effortless. If you're using this machine for very important tasks, whether it be hobbies or your own business, just do a bit of research and make sure that they do 100% run either natively for M1 or through Rosetta. If they do, you just don't notice the difference, it just works. 8 gig versus 16 gig of RAM. So this is the base spec. You can't get a cheaper M1 MacBook Air than this. It's the cheapest one you can get, which means it comes with 8 gig of RAM. Now, I purposely bought that because I wanted to just see what this base version is like and give you decent buying advice on that. But I know a lot of people will be looking at that option and thinking, 8 gig, it's not much. You know, we're kind of pre-programmed to think that 8 gig of RAM is just nothing. And actually, I don't think that's the case. Now, I did put this up against the 16-inch MacBook Pro. I will link to that video here. And that was a kind of basic exporting and rendering test in Final Cut Pro. Now, the rendering, it actually beat the 16-inch MacBook Pro, noticeably quicker. But the export, it wasn't quite as impressive. The 16-inch flew through that. This one took a little while, quite a while to be honest. And I realised after a while that it was to do with the fact I was running more than one app in the background on both machines. And the MacBook Air struggled a bit with that. The majority of people who watched that video and who know more than me pointed out that it's probably down to memory bandwidth. The way that the M1 chip works, just very quick layman's terms again, everything is on that chip. So the graphics processor, the main processor, the memory, and all the other bits and pieces that you need to run a computer are in that chip. Typically, that isn't the case. So historically, for an Intel Mac, for example, and certainly on this one, I have a separate graphics card in there. The memory is separate. Everything is separate. So while 8 gig of RAM isn't fantastic for heavy workloads, like really heavy workloads, it doesn't actually matter for most normal everyday tasks. And you never really feel like you're running out of memory. And that's, I think, because the apps and the stuff that you're doing within those apps is having to do a lot less moving around. It's all contained within that M1 chip. Now, I haven't done what lots of other people have done and opened 900 Chrome tabs or 8,000 Safari tabs to see how it copes, because that isn't general everyday use. However, I'm not always that good with tabs. I tend to leave quite a few of them open, and this thing does not slow down at all, and it only has 8 gig of RAM. So my advice on the RAM, if you're hovering again over that button, I think the difference is about $200. It's not a huge difference, but because everything is Apple made and you cannot get, you can't expand the memory on this yourself. You can't open it up. Well, you can open it up, but once you're in there, you can't change the memory. You have to get the right memory at the start when you buy it. My advice with that, if you do general tasks with your laptop, if you're not doing intensive video editing and concurrent tasks that last longer than, say, 10, 15 minutes, just get the 8 gig version. Honestly, you don't notice it at all. 16 gig's nice to have a bit of headroom, and if you're just the sort of person, which I totally understand, you just want to know that you've got that headroom, spend the extra $200 and get the 16-inch version. And like I say, I've been using this for most of the tasks that I use to run my business and run this channel, including video editing. And although occasionally with the video editing, it's a little bit slower than the 16-inch, it's not £2,500 slower, which is the difference roughly in cost between these two machines. Just a very quick note on the design. Now, classic Apple, you know, when the M1 powered MacBooks were rumoured, there were lots of concurrent rumours about what they look like. You know, would they have a smaller bezel? Would it be even thinner? All sorts of rumours. And classic Apple, they didn't do anything. They did not change the design whatsoever. So the MacBook Air is as thin, light, and tapered at the end as it always has been. It looks no different. And the downside of that is that we still have these great big bezels. And if you compare them against the likes of the Dell XPS series, and in fact lots of other laptops, it looks a little bit old-fashioned. There's no getting away from it. However, I still love the design, and I'm not an Apple fanboy at all. I just like their laptops. They feel solid, and it still feels very premium, which it should, because you're paying a premium, you know, you're paying the Apple tax to get it. Just don't expect anything radical. I think that will come next year. Now, one of the biggest things about this M1 MacBook Air, and one of the things that I was kind of suspecting, is that it has replaced my 12.9-inch iPad Pro. I used this, I still use it occasionally, as mainly a writing device, light email work, that kind of stuff. I'll be honest, since I've got the M1 MacBook Air, this is getting very little use. And I think that's just, as I say, indicative of the fact that macOS is still a more powerful operating system. It's just, for me anyway, you know, I'm not suggesting that iPadOS is useless at all, it's not. But when it comes to the way that I work, and I think the way that a lot of people work, you can't beat macOS. It's just the device I go for, and that does mean, weirdly, the MacBook Air M1 version is an iPad Pro killer. How does that work? You know, it wasn't long ago we were talking about, can an iPad Pro replace your laptop? Well, this has happened in the reverse for me. I just find that quite interesting. If you are thinking about buying this Air, I would just bear in mind a a few things. The first one being actually really simple is the lack of ports, and there are only 2 USB-C ports on here. They're very powerful, they power all sorts of things and do lots of clever stuff. But for me, having used the 16-inch MacBook Pro for over a year now, I really miss having ports on both sides. Just the convenience of being able to plug in your power supply on either side of the laptop, I got so used to that, to be honest. I guess the fact that the battery is so good on this makes that less of an issue, and it does, to be fair. But if you are a port person and you're not a dongle person, it could get a bit annoying. The other thing is those sustained workflows, and again, people who are much smarter than me and cleverer than me with this stuff have pointed out that anything, if you're doing a video rendering for longer than 10 minutes, this is going to struggle. And the reason for that is that the MacBook Air M1 doesn't have a fan. It's not actively cooled, so if things get too much for the processor, it has to ramp down the processor's speed, which is just understandable when you have no fan in there. The fanless design is quite desirable because it's completely silent. The other thing is the smaller screen. If you're coming from a 13-inch laptop, obviously you'll have no problem because that's the size of the MacBook Air. But if you're coming from the 16-inch, I'm not sure why you'd go from a 16-inch MacBook Pro to an Air at the moment, to be honest. I only have both because I run this channel, but if you were, you will miss that 16-inch screen. No matter how much that screams in terms of fan usage and the heat it generates when it gets busy, it's still an incredible machine when it comes to screen real estate. I love the size of the 16-inch MacBook Pro. It makes it less portable, yeah, but it does give you more screen estate, and you might miss that potentially. And those bezels do feel a bit hemmed in, there's no two ways about that. It also doesn't have the touch bar. For some people, including me actually, that's a benefit. But if you're into that kind of stuff and you like your touch bar, it doesn't have it. It does have Touch ID, which is fantastic. I think it's abundantly clear that I love this laptop. I've genuinely fallen in love with it. It's just so convenient. And like I say, I'm in a strange position where I have this and the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and I know that isn't a normal use case. I know most people won't have 2 laptops. It's pointless and expensive, but it's given me a really good insight into how these 2 devices could fit into your life. And for me, actually, they both do. There's no two ways about it. I still rely on this big beast, mainly because it doesn't, the performance is not impacted at all, no matter what you throw at it. It's an incredibly powerful machine. But it isn't this. It doesn't have the same, people have called it snappiness that you get from the M1 chip, and I kind of understand that. Again, it feels very iPad-like, both in the battery life that you get and also the way that it just immediately turns on, and there's no waiting for things to load as much as there would be on an Intel Mac. I'm really excited about Apple Silicon. I think it's going to be an incredibly interesting 2, 3, 4, 5 years ahead in terms of where they go with this. This really is just the start, but because they've had that head start with iOS and the iPad and the iPhones in terms of developing their own chipsets, it's not a brand new thing, the M1. I think there's a bit of a misconception occasionally that this is a kind of a first iteration, you've got to be careful with it. Actually, it has 10 years worth of development behind it, and it feels like that as well, it really does. And what has amazed me the most about the M1 MacBook Air, the base spec version, is that it is just effortless. It doesn't feel like you're using that first generation of a chip. So in conclusion, if you're pretty desperate to get your hands on an M1 Mac, I really do recommend checking out the Air. And just go for the base version, honestly, unless you've got particularly challenging workflows and you do a lot of video editing or a lot of whatever it might be, this will serve you fantastically. And I think for $999, £999, it's actually a bit of a bargain when you bear in mind how long these machines last and how long they remain relevant. And just that battery life is incredible. Now, as mentioned, I did recently undertake a slightly more scientific comparison between the 16-inch MacBook Pro and the M1 powered MacBook Air. It was a video test in terms of exporting video and rendering video, and the results were fascinating. It's a live reaction from me. You'll see how shocked I was by a couple of the things that happened. And yeah, if you want to watch that, keep watching. In the meantime, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.